Okay, welcome back to the channel. Today's video is one that was requested by a few people, so I'm going to give you a kind of guided tour of the engine bay. Quite a lot of people wanted to know what are all these red and blue pipey wiry things and what do they do. So I'm going to have an attempt at a layman's term description of things in TVR's engine bay. This would apply to the Chimaera and the Griff models with the rover V8. Probably quite a lot of the Wedges have the same engine. This thing here, this is the brake fluid reservoir, and you can see it's set into the wing, so you must make sure that this seal, which is Sikaflex, is good, otherwise you tend to get wet feet inside the car. These red things are the ignition leads. They come from the distributor. There's the distributor cap. The distributor cap on these engines only has a rotor arm inside that goes round, so there's a central contact here, generally called the king lead. That takes the spark that's coming from the coil, which we'll look at later, and then it goes round each of these as it spins. So that one gets it, then that one, then that one, then that one. And these are set up in the correct firing order for the engine. The electricity then travels down the wire to the spark plug, which is down there. On TVRs, people generally have an extender on the end of the plug, which is made of metal. That's mainly to get this thing out of the way of the heat of these exhausts, which are very hot. The actual spark electricity to the king lead comes from the coil. So that lead plugs in the end here on this big rubbery lead. The coil is switched on and off by this little gadget at the back here. This is the ignition amplifier. So that essentially, you can't really see it, it's under there, it's like a potted component, little plastic black square, and essentially the signal that comes from the distributor spinning round, there's a signal that comes to here, and this device switches on and off the high voltage of the coil. So it turns the coil on, and then when it switches the coil off, the energy field that's generated inside the coil collapses, and that's what produces the electricity for the spark. So if the ignition amp fails, the engine won't run. The coil fails. Coils generally tend to fail slowly over time, so you'll start to get a misfire at high revs, and then eventually it will fail altogether. With coils you can usually tell because they start to get oily. These have got an electrical coil inside, a copper coil, and they're generally oil filled. The oil will generally start to leak out when they start to fail. This one, well, it's a Bosch and they're built like tanks, so I suggest you get one of these. This black thing with the knurly top is the power steering reservoir. So the power steering fluid's in here. If I take this off, you'll be able to see. So in there is that lovely pink ATF fluid. There's a little dipstick with a mark on to show you if it's the right level. The fluid goes down those blue pipes, goes around the other side of the engine, which will just take a quick trip round to this side. This silvery thing here, this is actually the cover. Inside this is the power steering pump, turned by the belt on the front of the engine, and you can see down there that they're the blue pipes. There's a low pressure side which comes from that reservoir we've just looked at, and the high pressure side goes down to the steering rack. Now, can we see the steering rack? So down there, see those copper pipes? That's the steering rack down there. That travels all the way across. In fact, there, that rubber concertinary boot there is one side of the steering rack, there's one on the other side, and the arm that comes out of that is attached to the wheel to make it turn. This big silvery thing is called the plenum. It's essentially just a big box. Inside here, on the top of the engine, there are little trumpety things. In the normal TVRs, they're just a bit of pipe, and they tend to be like different lengths. And that takes the air into each of the cylinders. The air comes from the air filter, which is in front of the radiator, comes up this pipe, through this gadget here with the cable on. That's the air-fuel mixture measuring device. It then comes round this corner through a butterfly valve, which is essentially like a door which opens like this when you press the throttle cable. So when you press the throttle cable, it makes the butterfly go in and out, lets more air in, The more air, the more fuel that the ECU can put into the engine. The fuel comes through injectors, and I'll show you those in a sec. Right, the injectors, you can see one down there. I'll just zoom in on it. Ooh. The injectors are in this sort of pushed into the side of the engine. That's one there with the cable on it, where my finger's pointing to. And there's 4 down each side. They're really difficult to see. Now is that one there? They're difficult to see because there's so much extra gubbins in here hiding them. You just have to take it on faith that they are there. And essentially when they get a signal, they open and they spray fuel into the cylinder, and when they don't get a signal, they close. All of that's controlled by the ECU, which is in the footwell of the TVR, and that controls how the engine runs. It's got a map inside the ECU which decides how much fuel and air the engine needs at different revs. Over here under the grid, this is the windscreen wiper motor and associated gearboxy gubbins, which makes your wipers go backwards and forwards. This is called the swirl pot. This is part of the cooling system, so the water from the engine comes in there and spools around, comes out the bottom and into the radiator. There's a radiator, 2 electric fans, and that silvery thing with the blue cap on off the Volkswagen Golf is the expansion tank. Most modern cars have expansion tanks. What you find with TVRs is it will find a level in the expansion tank, and it doesn't matter how much fluid you put in there, it will pretty much stay at the level it likes. They're all different. There's nothing wrong with yours if it's at the bottom or if it's at the top. It'll just be where it likes to be. Right, another view from the other side. So, power steering pump, belt comes round. This big pulley here has got the water pump behind it. The water pump has a little, what they call a telltale hole underneath, so if the seal fails, generally water will drip out of it to indicate to you that there's something wrong with the water pump and you ought to change it. Then comes up to this device here. This is the alternator that generates the 12 volts for the car, so it charges the battery. That's where the 100 amp fuse that you may have heard of, that's fastened to the chassis down near the starter motor, the 100 amp fuse is for this. So the 100 amp fuse is between the alternator and the battery, so if the fuse goes, the car will still start, but the alternator won't then charge the battery, and when the battery goes flat it won't start anymore. This one is the belt tensioner, so this just keeps tension on the belt, and the one down the bottom there, the big one, is on the end of the crankshaft. This is the exhaust system. Strangely on this car goes forward and then backward, so it comes out of the engine, and in this straight bit here is a pre-cat, so a small catalyst in there. These cause problems sometimes, they sometimes block up and you have to take them out. There's then a link there, and it goes down, same on the other side, it goes down into that big can there, and inside that is the main catalyst for the engine. The exhaust then goes off and underneath the car, as it normally would in other vehicles. This is a common one we get on the back of the plenum. On the driver's side is this big black nut thing with a cable in the back of it. There's the lead. This is the infamous stepper motor. Essentially all this is a cone that goes in and out, controlled by the ECU. So there's a cone which saves my finger, and inside the plenum there's a cone that matches it. It goes in and out like that, pushed in and out by the stepper motor, and that's to control the idle. Sometimes you'll see it where you'll come to a junction, you'll stop, and the engine will race slightly, and then it will sort of grab control of it and come down to where it ought to be. That's the stepper motor moving. Down below that, these hoses here, these are the fuel, so one from the tank and one going off. These are a source of concern, mainly because these cars are getting old now, you know, but this car I've got is 20 years old. I've already changed these hoses, mainly because they started to leak, which is a terrifying experience. So this is something you really need to check regularly and probably replace regularly. It will save you a lot of misery. Lastly, this white thing at the front, there we go, this white thing, that's where your washer fluid goes for screen wash. If you lose that cap, a Tesco's milk bottle cap fits it beautifully.